The street lights flickered as the patrol car slowly rolled down the quiet suburban street. Officer Mark Reynolds adjusted his rearview mirror, his mind wandering to his usual routine. Another shift, another set of faces he wouldn't remember. As he turned the corner, his headlights illuminated a man standing by a sleek black car parked along the curb. The man wore a tailored suit, his phone in one hand, and a briefcase resting on the hood. Mark's brow furrowed. It wasn't the car or the suit that caught his attention. It was the man's skin color. This was an affluent neighborhood, and in Mark's mind, the two didn't match. He pulled over, letting the tires crunch against the gravel shoulder, and stepped out of his vehicle. "Evening," Mark said, his tone sharp, bordering on accusatory. "What are you doing out here?" The man glanced up, calm and composed. There was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Just taking a call," he replied, his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mark folded his arms, sizing him up. "This your car?" "Yes," the man said, raising an eyebrow. "Why?" Mark ignored the question and gestured to the briefcase. "What's in there?" The man sighed, clearly unimpressed with the line of questioning. "Work documents. Confidential." Mark's instincts, or perhaps his biases, kicked in. "Mind if I take a look?" "Yes, I do," the man replied firmly, now putting his phone in his pocket. "Unless you have probable cause, officer." Mark's jaw tightened. The man's calm demeanor irritated him, made him feel challenged. "Step away from the vehicle," Mark barked, his hand moving toward his holster. The man raised his hand slightly, not in fear, but in exasperation. "Officer, there's no need for this. I haven't done anything wrong." "Step away," Mark repeated, his voice louder this time. After a tense pause, the man complied, stepping back with an air of reluctant authority. Mark called in for backup and began rifling through the man's belongings without permission, ignoring the protests. It didn't matter to him that the man was cooperative, or that his identification, which Mark barely glanced at, showed no cause for concern. To Mark, this was just another incident of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The backup arrived, a younger officer who seemed uneasy with the situation but followed Mark's lead. They placed the man in handcuffs, ignoring his protests about the lack of justification. Mark smirked as he drove the man to the station, certain that he had caught someone who didn't belong. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Mark entered confidently, eager to present his case to the judge. The man, now wearing the same suit, but without the briefcase, sat calmly in the defendant's seat, his expression unreadable. As the judge called the session to order, Mark prepared himself for what he thought would be a routine procedure. But then the man stood up, straightened his tie, and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce myself." Mark's snub expression faltered as the words rang out. "My name is Marcus L. Davis," the man continued, "and I am the Attorney General of this state." The courtroom fell silent. Mark's confidence drained as he realized the magnitude of his actions. This wasn't just a routine arrest. It was a colossal mistake. The judge's eyes narrowed, and murmurs spread among the spectators. Mark felt his stomach drop. What was supposed to be a simple case had turned into a career-threatening disaster, and he could only brace himself for what would come next. Mark's heart pounded as he tried to process what he'd just heard. The Attorney General. His mind raced back to the previous night. The handcuffs, the dismissive attitude he'd shown, the way he had dove through the man's belongings without a second thought. His throat went dry as Marcus L. Davis, now standing confidently in front of the judge, adjusted his suit jacket and gave Mark a brief, almost knowing glance. It wasn't anger in his eyes, but something worse, disappointment. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand gripping the file he prepared. Everything about this case had just flipped on its head. He had been sure of himself, maybe too sure. The arrest had felt routine, part of his usual mindset on the job. But now, with the courtroom silent and the weight of his mistake hanging in the air, he felt exposed. Judge Campbell, a stern woman known for her no-nonsense approach, leaned forward. She clasped her hands together on the bench, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Mr. Davis, I apologize," she said carefully, though her tone hinted that even she was taken aback. "I assume you have some thoughts on how we should proceed." Marcus's lips twitched slightly, but he kept his expression composed. "I do, Your Honor," he replied. "But first, I'd like to hear Officer Reynolds' account of the incident." Mark's eyes flicked nervously toward the younger officer who had been with him the previous night. The kid looked just as rattled, sinking lower in his seat as if he wanted to disappear. Mark stood slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. His palms felt damp, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to say. He cleared his throat, hoping to buy himself a second to collect his thoughts. Yes, Your Honor," Mark began, keeping his gaze down on the papers in his hands. "I was patrolling the neighborhood around 10 p.m. I spotted Mr. Davis standing near in his vehicle. I thought it looked suspicious, given the time and the location." The judge raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "I approached him and asked some routine questions," Mark continued, his voice tightening. "He refused to allow me to search his briefcase. His attitude seemed evasive, so I called for backup." Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable, but Mark could feel the tension radiating from the table where he stood. "And then," the judge prompted. "We placed him in custody for further questioning," Mark said, though the words felt hollow even to him. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment. The judge's eyes flicked over to Marcus, silently inviting him to respond. Marcus finally broke his silence, his voice calm but precise. "Officer Reynolds, do you recall checking my ID?" Mark hesitated. He remembered looking at it briefly, but in truth, he hadn't cared enough to actually register the name. He had been too focused on assumptions, ones he could no longer justify. Yes, I saw it," Mark muttered, though it didn't sound convincing. Marcus let out a soft sigh. "I introduced myself, officer. I told you who I was, twice." Mark's face burned. He could feel the eyes of the other officers and courtroom staff boring into him. "You didn't believe me," Marcus continued, not out of spite, but with a quiet, controlled disappointment. "And rather than de-escalate, you doubled down." Mark shifted his weight, unable to look up. Judge Campbell's gaze hardened. "Officer Reynolds, is this true?" Mark opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. There was no denying it. The way Marcus told it was exactly how it had happened. Mark's assumptions, his stubbornness, it had all blinded him to the truth standing right in front of him. "Yes, Your Honor," Mark admitted, forcing the words out. The judge leaned back in her chair, lips pressed in a thin line. "I see," she said quietly, letting the weight of those two words hang in the air. Marcus stepped forward slightly. "Your Honor, I'm not interested in pressing charges," he said, his voice softening. Mark's head shot up in surprise. The tension in his chest loosened, but only slightly. But Marcus added, fixing his gaze firmly on Mark, "I think there's an important conversation that needs to happen. Not just between me and Officer Reynolds, but within the department itself." The judge nodded. "Agreed," she said, before turning back to Mark. "Officer, you are dismissed for now. But consider this a serious warning. We will be reviewing this case further." Mark gave a curt nod and quickly gathered his things, feeling the stares following him all the way to the door. As he stepped outside the courtroom, he exhaled slowly, the cool air of the hallway doing little to ease his racing thoughts. He wasn't sure what felt worse, the embarrassment or the nagging realization that everything Marcus had said was right. Mark sat alone in his patrol car later that evening, parked at the far end of the station's lot. His shift had technically ended an hour ago, but he wasn't ready to head home. The faint hum of passing traffic filled the silence, but his thoughts were louder. He replayed the courtroom scene in his head, each moment sinking deeper into his chest. Marcus Davis wasn't the kind of man Mark could forget, nor was he someone Mark could brush aside. He didn't expect kindness, not after what happened. But Marcus's decision not to press charges bothered him more than if he had. It wasn't mercy, it was something else. A reminder that Marcus had the power to destroy Mark's career, but chose not to. That thought lingered uncomfortably. Mark tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He thought about all the faces he had encountered during his years on the force. How many times had he made assumptions like the one with Marcus? How often had he justified his actions under the guise of just doing his job? A sharp knock on his window startled him. Mark glanced over and saw Officer Darnell, his younger partner from the night of the arrest, standing outside with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. Mark rolled the window down halfway, letting in the cool air. "Thought you left," Darnell said, his eyes flicking to the dashboard clock. "Just needed a minute," Mark replied. Darnell nodded but didn't move away. He shifted awkwardly, glancing around as if making sure no one else was nearby. "Look, Mark, about last night," Darnell began carefully. "I didn't say anything in the courtroom, but—" "You don't have to," Mark cut him off, his tone firmer than he intended. "I know what it looked like." Darnell hesitated, then stepped closer. "I get it. We've all made calls like that. But maybe it's time to rethink how we do things." Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't want to hear it, not from Darnell. The kid was barely out of the academy, still green in ways Mark wasn't. But deep down, Mark knew he was right. "Marcus Davis could have ended your career today," Darnell added quietly. "I think you should ask yourself why he didn't." Mark said nothing, watching as Darnell gave a small nod and walked back toward the station. The door closed behind him with a faint thud, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts once again. By the time Mark pulled into his driveway, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across his lawn. He sat there for a few moments, staring at the house but not moving. His wife's car was parked neatly beside his, and the faint glow of the living room lights seeped through the curtains. Mark finally forced himself out of the car and stepped inside. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air, but the house was quiet. His wife, Emily, was curled up on the couch, flipping through channels with a blanket draped over her legs. She glanced up as he walked in. "You're late," she said softly, not accusing but curious. "Rough day," Mark replied, dropping his keys on the counter. Emily studied his face for a moment, setting the remote aside. "Want to talk about it?" Mark hesitated. He'd rarely brought work home with him, but this time felt different. He sat down beside her, letting out a long sigh. "There was an incident," Mark started, unsure of how to frame it. "I arrested someone last night. Thought I was following protocol, but I was wrong." Emily frowned slightly, waiting for him to continue. "The guy was Marcus Davis," Mark said, watching for her reaction. Her eyes widened. "The Attorney General?" "Mark." "I know," he interrupted, rubbing his temples. "Believe me, I know." Emily didn't say anything right away. She simply reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've been doing this job for a long time," she said softly, "but maybe it's time to look at things from a different angle." Mark gave a faint nod, though the weight of her words sat heavily on his shoulders. Later that night, long after Emily had gone to bed, Mark found himself scrolling through news articles about Marcus Davis. There were countless headlines, policy reforms, community outreach programs, cases he had taken on and won. Marcus wasn't just the Attorney General, he was deeply respected. A figure who had made real change in places Mark had never even considered. Mark's eyes lingered on a photo of Marcus standing beside a group of young students during a charity event. The same calm, authoritative expression he had worn in the courtroom was present even there. Mark shut the laptop, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't sure where things would go from here, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The courtroom incident was behind him, but it lingered in ways he hadn't expected. Even back on patrol, everything felt different. Conversations that used to pass over him without thought now seemed louder. Interactions with people on the street felt heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching, waiting to see how he'd handle himself. A week later, Mark was parked near the corner of Monroe and Fifth, watching the late afternoon traffic thin out. Darnell sat quietly beside him, tapping his fingers against the door. It had been an uneventful shift so far, too quiet for Mark's liking. The silence left too much room for his thoughts to creep in. "You good?" Darnell finally asked, breaking the silence. Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Just thinking." "About Davis?" Mark hesitated. "Yeah." Darnell shifted, glancing over with a half-smile. "Maybe you should talk to him." Mark let out a short laugh. "Right, because that'll go over well." "I'm serious," Darnell replied. "I mean, he's not just going to forget. Maybe this is one of those things you deal with head-on." Mark wanted to brush it off, but Darnell's words stuck with him. The idea seemed absurd. What could he possibly say? "Sorry, I wrongfully arrested you." That didn't feel like enough. Before Mark could answer, his radio crackled to life, cutting through the thick air. There was a report of a disturbance a few blocks away. Nothing serious, but enough to shake them from their thoughts. As Mark pulled away from the curb, the faint tension hanging over the patrol car seemed to dissolve. He focused on the road, letting the hum of the engine drown out everything else. They arrived at the scene within minutes. A small corner store where an argument between two customers had gotten out of hand. By the time Mark stepped inside, the situation had mostly diffused. The owner, an older man with weary eyes, shook his head apologetically. "Sorry about that, officers." "Just a misunderstanding," he said, glancing at the two men now quietly standing by the door. Mark nodded, exchanging a few words with the men to ensure things wouldn't escalate further. It was routine, nothing more. But as Mark turned to leave, he caught sight of someone walking along the sidewalk outside. Marcus Davis. Mark's pulse jumped. He hadn't expected to see him, and by the way Marcus's eyes flicked toward him through the glass, it was clear the feeling was mutual. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Marcus offered the briefest of nods, polite but distant, and kept walking. Mark hesitated, watching him disappear down the street. "Mark." Darnell's voice brought him back to the present. "Everything good?" Mark nodded, though his mind was racing. Later that evening, long after his shift had ended, Mark found himself parked outside a community center on the east side of town. He hadn't meant to end up there, but something pulled him in that direction. The center was hosting a public event, and through the large front windows, Mark spotted Marcus standing at the far end of the room, speaking to a small group of people. Mark stayed in the car for several minutes, debating whether to go inside. Every logical part of him told him to drive away, but his gut refused to listen. Finally, with a long breath, Mark stepped out of the car. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but filled with an underlying buzz. Conversations hummed around him, but Mark barely noticed as he moved toward the back of the room. Marcus's voice carried clearly as he spoke about community initiatives and the importance of law enforcement working alongside citizens. It wasn't until the event began to wind down that Marcus noticed Mark standing quietly by the door. Their eyes met, and this time Marcus didn't look away. "Officer Hammond," Marcus said as he approached his turn measured. "Didn't expect to see you here." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't sure if I should come." Marcus studied him for a long moment before nodding. "But you did." Mark swallowed, feeling the weight of the conversation before it even started. "I guess I needed to." Marcus's eyes softened slightly, though its expression remained unreadable. "Walk with me," he said, motioning toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air washed over them. The streets were quiet, and their footsteps echoed faintly as they walked side by side. "I've been doing this a long time," Marcus said finally. "Long enough to know people can change if they're willing to." Mark glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to explain what happened that night," Marcus continued. "I know exactly why it happened." Mark felt his chest tighten. "I was wrong." Marcus stopped, turning to face him. "I know." For a moment, the tension hung thick between them, but it wasn't hostile. It felt necessary. I didn't press charges because I've seen officers like you before, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. Some of them learn from their mistakes, others don't. Mark met his gaze, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside him. I want to be better, Mark said quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he fully processed them. Marcus held his gaze for a long time before nodding. Then start now. They stood there in silence, the street lights casting long shadows across the pavement. And for the first time in days, Mark felt like he was finally beginning to understand what came next. The quiet between them didn't last long. As Mark and Marcus stood near the curb, the low hum of the city night pressing in around them, Mark felt something shift, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just about that night anymore. It was bigger, heavier, like a door had cracked open to something neither of them could see yet. I appreciate you coming out here, Marcus said eventually, his tone lighter, but still carrying the weight of their earlier conversation. But let's not pretend one walk fixes everything. Mark nodded. I know. Marcus glanced down the street, something catching his eye. You might get a chance to prove it sooner than you think. Before Mark could ask what he meant, Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. The community's been tense lately. More than usual. Mark frowned. Because of me? Marcus shook his head. Not just you. People are on edge, feeling like they're not being heard. You know how that goes. Mark nodded slowly. He'd seen it before, but hearing it now, right from Marcus, made it feel different, more real. They parted ways shortly after, but Marcus's words lingered. By the time Mark slid into his car, he felt like he was bracing for something he didn't fully understand yet. The next day, Mark found himself back on his usual patrol route, but the streets felt different. Maybe it was his own awareness heightening things, but there was an energy he couldn't shake. Conversations seemed more clipped. Groups gathered near storefronts kept glancing over their shoulders. Even small interactions with shop owners felt laced with unspoken words. Late that afternoon, Mark and Darnell responded to a call about a suspicious vehicle parked outside a closed-down factory. It wasn't unusual, just another call on a long list of routine checks. But when they arrived, the lot was empty. Only fading tire tracks hinted that someone had been there. Darnell looked around, hands on his hips. False alarm. Maybe, Mark replied, but something didn't sit right. The whole area felt too still, as if someone had left in a hurry. Mark stepped toward the entrance, peering through the dirty glass. There wasn't much to see, but as he turned to head back to the car, his eye caught something, a faint flicker of movement deeper inside the building. Did you see that? Mark asked quietly. Darnell squinted through the glass but shook his head. No one's supposed to be in there. You want to check it out? Mark hesitated, then nodded. They called in their location and proceeded inside. The factory was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and rust. Light filtered in through cracks in the roof, casting faint shadows across the floor. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing the vast emptiness. Near the back, just beyond a row of rusted machines, Mark spotted something, an old wooden door slightly ajar. He exchanged a glance with Darnell, then pushed it open. The room beyond was small, almost like an office, but it was clear someone had been using it recently. A folding chair sat in the corner, and a half-empty water bottle rested on the desk. Scattered papers lay across the surface, but what caught Mark's attention was the photograph pinned to the wall. It was Marcus. Mark stared at the image, his mind racing. Darnell leaned in, eyebrows knitting together. Why would someone have a photo of Davis out here? Mark didn't have an answer. The photograph wasn't threatening, just a simple picture of Marcus standing in front of the community center. But the fact that it was here, in this abandoned factory, felt wrong. Maybe he's involved in something we don't know about, Darnell suggested carefully. Mark shook his head. No, this doesn't feel like that. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the room before carefully leaving everything as it was. As they drove away, Mark couldn't shake the unease settling over him. There was something deeper happening, something Marcus hadn't mentioned. That evening, Mark parked outside the community center again, but this time he didn't go in. He stayed in the car, watching as Marcus left the building, heading down the street alone. A few blocks away, another figure trailed at a distance, carefully keeping to the shadows. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Whoever they weren't just passing by. Mark started the engine and eased forward, keeping his distance as he followed. The deeper into the neighborhood they went, the clearer it became that this wasn't random. Marcus eventually turned down a narrow alleyway, but the shadow trailing him hesitated before disappearing around the corner. Mark pulled up just as Marcus emerged from the other side, glancing behind him with the faintest look of concern before continuing down the block. The alley was empty by the time Mark stepped out of his car. Whoever it was had vanished. Mark stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness. Whatever was going on, Marcus hadn't told him everything. And now, Mark was beginning to wonder if he'd walked into something far more dangerous than he realized.